Was thinking about a title for this. We sold everything to live with less. And I didn't expect this part. That's what I want to talk about tonight. That's what I want to talk about on this episode. Last couple of weeks, I've covered career and the last 15 months in building this channel. But now it's a bit more personal in terms of possessions. Last Friday, Yvonne and I were in Penang train station and we were about to wait for our train to take us back to Kuala Lumpur after a 5-week stay. And we were heading down the escalators and I turned to Yvonne with a suitcase on the stairs, a rucksack on my back and a rucksack on Yvonne's back. And I said to her, "Can you believe this is all that we own in the world? This is everything." And she looked at me and laughed and she said, "It needs to be less." And that sentence has lived with me over the last week as I wanted to cover this topic about living with less. Because a year ago, 12 months ago, 15, 16 months ago, we'd have been living in a house. How do you say it? A 3-story townhouse, ground floor, first floor, second floor, 2-story townhouse that we had lived in for nearly 13 years. It had furniture, it had clothes, we had 2 cars in the driveway, we had a garage full of stuff, a garden. I mean, you talk about clothes, right? We had work clothes, we had going out clothes, we had music band stuff that I would wear, we had old memories, and also a lifetime record collection of mine that I'm going to talk about. And as we stood in that train station, right, with one suitcase and Yvonne saying, basically hinting at me, "It's still too much." That's kind of the topic that sparked off in my head. And it's not really in a kind of, I'm not presenting this in a, we live a minimalist lifestyle, like a kind of lecture on that front. It's not I feel enlightened by being unburdened by things. That's not really the kind of topic that I'm trying to cover. It's just that in some ways, life kind of shaped these decisions in many ways and took me into a world of stripping away physical evidence of our old lives. So that's really the kind of ethos of this discussion that I wanted to get into. So what happens when you remove all of the objects that used to prove who you were? That's the real topic for tonight, especially when it comes to that record collection for me. I'm going to get into that because possessions are not just possessions, right? They are, in many ways, they are proof that you have worked, that you have earned money, that you've built a life, that you had taste in some ways, especially when it came to that record collection, that you had a career, that you had hobbies, right? That maybe you had some kind of old version of yourself that existed. That's what all those possessions could mean. And so what happens when most of that stuff goes? So none of this was really driven by minimalism. This wasn't I woke up one day and was like, "Hey, I want to live this minimalist life." I didn't watch a Netflix documentary on all of this and decide to change life around. This was driven by a trigger in probably both of our lives, Yvonne as well, but definitely for me, and that was the past of my dad. And, I've talked about that extensively, so I don't want to dive into repeating that topic, but just as the outline of this, dealing with his house, dealing with his possessions, the cupboards, the drawers, the paperwork, all of the sentimental items, the things that he'd hoarded over those years, not just from my own childhood in life, but from my brothers and sisters. Um, all of that was incredibly challenging to deal with, and that fundamentally changed something in me over that period of time of dealing with that. Um, that had a really profound effect on me cleaning that house out. Um, and so, you know, when you've got to clear somebody else's house out after they die, you start to realize something quite uncomfortable in all of that. And it's that everything that we own eventually will become a question that somebody else has to answer down the line. And I can think back to standing in different rooms of my dad's house and having to make decisions over items. And that's really when I thought about that statement for this chat tonight, that those possessions, your possessions, will eventually become a decision for somebody else to make. That felt very profound, and really left me to reflect back on that period. So when I was doing all of that, I was sharing a lot of it on the YouTube channel. I was talking extensively about that, about traveling back and forth between Northampton and East Kilbride, my dad's home, my hometown, my birth town, and dealing with those decisions. And when I was talking about it on the YouTube channel, I really remember quite vividly. I don't think people really recognize how impactful comments can be at times on channels. I reflect and think about some comments that have came through, sometimes for hours, days, weeks, and in this occasion, it's now years. And there was one comment from somebody that guided me towards the Swedish Death Protocol, a book that was really aimed about focusing your mind as a older person about what you would be leaving behind and the decisions that people would have to make. And I looked into that. I spent a bit of time kind of researching it. And then it started to make me think beyond dealing with my dad's house and possessions to my own life and possessions, and looking around this house that Yvonne and I had built, and the things that we'd acquired, and like what they meant to me, and the kind of weight of stuff over that period. Now, I also remember very fondly, I think a friend who had recently had a parent pass away as well had said to me, whatever you do, just don't make any rash decisions in the first year. Right. I think about that often because in the space of a year after all of that had happened, I was making some very big decisions. So I'm not sure I was really taken to the head that conversation that my pal was having with me about don't make a big decision, and here I was preparing to be out of work and leave a country and everything else. But I think about that a lot, and possessions and the choices of possessions was playing into that, because I was starting to ask myself about my own stuff, like, what am I leaving behind? Like, who's going to have to deal with all of this stuff? And I started to go around my own house at this point, and I was talking to Yvonne, and I started telling her about what things would be worth, like as if something was going to happen, right? Particularly around the record collection. Now, I'd spent some time documenting all of that, so I was trying to advise Yvonne what it was worth, and I was just having this kind of real period of, I mean, it would have been grief, right? It wouldn't have been anything other than grief, and reflecting on these possessions. But I was also kind of like looking at things and thinking, do they still matter? Do they still mean anything, right? Wandering around a house that had got bigger over the years and more stuff that we'd accumulated. And, I kept kind of coming back to the same question, like, is this stuff important? Does it need to be kept? And that was all taking me down this path of like deciding on possessions. Do I still like this? Am I still interested in this? Why am I still carrying this item? And by carrying, I mean, the idea of the weight of it. That was landing with me. And then it gets to the point where I started to think about, at some point this will be somebody else's burden, and what that was like to go through my dad's house now. Those are quite heavy topics to kind of think about, but it's all of the decisions, the triggers that were getting me to this point of thinking about possessions. So, the old house, the house that we left behind last year would have been evidence of all of this, right? Life started for Yvonne and I in a tiny flat in East Kilbride, and all of these years later, we're in a much bigger house with way more possessions, right? Talking about a townhouse, and it wasn't just a house anymore. It was like it was a container for a whole version of your life. The things that you accumulate, clothes, clothes that I would have worn for like past jobs, suits, ties, shoes. You get your wedding suit, you keep a hold of it. Household items, right? Joked about this before, but the kitchen drawer that has a million cables or utensils inside it that you just keep accumulating and you never clear it out. My dad had the same, we had the same. Things in drawers that you just never look at. Yvonne's wrote a blog tonight talking about a kind of granular level detail of this. Clothes that she used to have that she would be like, oh, I might get back into them at some point, change weight or whatever, and something might fit again, but you keep a hold of it. And then things in the garage. For me, that was like cycling stuff and boxes. I would keep boxes for things, computers and TVs. And, if I sell this, I might need the box. And then there's the future projects that you might work on. The garage is always a great place for that. Oh, I'm going to keep that because I might need that as a future project. Somewhere down the line, I might build that or I might fix that, all of those kind of things. And the things that you buy because you might need them one day. That's another one. And then there's the stuff that you just had forgotten you even owned in the first place, right? The loft, the garage, cupboards, things that you've accumulated. You're like, oh, I forgot I even had that. The garage is a great example of that. This was the first house we ever had that had a garage. And it kind of becomes like, a museum of imaginary projects for down the line. I would have bike wheels, and I had a summer bike and a winter bike and a mountain bike and things off of each of those bikes and things that I would, swap around at different times. In the winter, I'd be in the garage on a turbo trainer. In the summer, I'd be out on that bike. There'd be bits of it lying around, showing me like old hobbies, things that I was into, things that I drifted away from. My dad used to always say to me, oh, there's a cupboard upstairs with your karate suit, your electrics, and, your skateboard. I'm like 40 odd year old, and my dad's telling me about the electrics and the karate suit from when I would have been 8 years old. And then you inherit that. You have the same cupboards at home, things that you just can't bear to part with. So, it becomes a museum of the person that you used to be. And so let's get on to the big topic, the part that was really sticking out for me in all of this, and that was the record collection. Now, I spent the best part of my entire life collecting that. I think I bought my very first single, which was Big Country, and it was the single Look Away, and it had the Restless Native soundtrack on the B-side, a film that I'd been to see at the cinema with my dad. Loved that movie, Scottish movie. So Big Country, first single, and I think I would have bought that when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And then from there, I would get regular pocket money and I'd go buy different singles and whatever I could afford, albums. And I never sold a single record in all of those years until last year. Now, the reason I bring this up, right, is because whenever you're listening to this, today is the 1st of July. The 4th of July last year, May the 4th, I was going to say maybe the 4th be with you, but that's May. What am I talking about? The 4th of July. That's when I sold the record collection. I had a look through my emails a couple of days ago, and I had a little look. And so it was a lifetime collection. I never sold really a record that I'd purchased over all those years. I pretty much kept the entire collection. I swapped one or two here or there. Had a few Metallica bits that I let go of, but the fundamental collection was there. And then just came this point where I was like, right, I want to sell this. And that had been something that had been kind of marinating in my head for a while. Before my dad passed away, I was getting to this point and I could never quite do it. I could never quite pull the trigger, and I talked to different businesses and people, and it meant a lot because I was a DJ for many years. Now, I'll say this just to keep this factual. I think I only played a couple of gigs, and I mean a couple with actual vinyl. I collected the records, but by the time I got into DJing and actually being a DJ and traveling, it was actually nearly always digital. It was either I used a laptop and I played on Ableton. So I had a lot of records ripped and I had copied that I would play out. But I actually had got to the era where carrying big record boxes wasn't really a thing. So most of my dance records I'd bought over the years was me kind of learning the trade. And by the time I kind of started to move into being an actual DJ of traveling to clubs and traveling around the world, I was mainly doing that digitally, USB pens or CD wallets or a laptop and playing through software. That was kind of how I did a lot of that. But I'd spent years and years buying the records, going to record stores, white labels, getting on record mailing lists and being sent them, and all the stuff that came with that, nights out and everything that kind of was in the identity of those records. You know, this was a big part of my identity, who I've been as an artist, as a musician, as a DJ, and just as a person for all those years. And bring it back to last Friday, right? I'm sitting on the train, and for the first time in quite a while, I just put my headphones in, and instead of watching YouTube videos or listening to podcasts, I just put some music on. And I was listening to a Scottish band called Mogwai, and was a track called Auto Rock, I think is the name of the track, which is from the soundtrack of Miami Vice, the end of it. Beautiful, progressive rock track. And I was just listening to that for the first time in ages. You know, no YouTube videos, just, you know, no scrolling through Instagram, no noise of the train, just noise cancelling and locked into the music. And I was kind of reminiscing because what was coming to mind was, oh, I owned this record. I owned this band. I owned a collection of them. And this was the first point that I was really thinking back to the physical collection of those items. And it was the first time in this pretty much a year that I was starting to think about the records being gone. But what was landing in my head was that I was still listening to the music the way I was mainly listening to it, which was digitally, right? Apple Music. I've got an Apple Music collection, or on Spotify. And it kind of made me ask myself at that point as I was listening to it, did I actually miss the records? Now, Yvonne and I have had a bit of a running joke through all of this, right? Bit of a kind of sense of humor, which was something would come on, a track would come on, and I would say to Yvonne, I used to own this on record, right? That just a bit of humor out of the whole situation. And then in my head, I'm like, did I miss them? And honestly, like, the real answer is it's more complicated than just a straight yes or a no. I miss parts of like what they represented. And I was really a collector of, I would buy a lot of records and I wouldn't even, I'm one of these people that I wouldn't even open some records. I was collecting them like Panini stickers, or, you know, the way that people, you know, collect a stamp in a book or something, right? I would keep the physical condition of it mint. Not always, not all of them, but a portion of them. And then I would still listen to it through Spotify. I was collecting to be a collector. So it wasn't that I was sitting down and actually doing the physical act of like playing a lot of the records. Yes, the dance music stuff, the DJ stuff, I would listen to. I had turntables, I would play them, but not a lot of the rock and the indie and the kind of stuff that I would define as collecting. So I wasn't really missing the ritual of kind of going through that action. You know, do I miss going into record stores and kind of having a little hunt through things? I still actually do that. Been in a record store here in Kuala Lumpur and just walked around and had a little flick through. But I look at the prices of things and I'm like, God, they're astronomical, right? £40, £50 to buy a record. And I just think, oh, this is just madness, right? But I'll tell you what I don't miss. See, when you have to move them around, I sometimes had my records in the kitchen and then I moved it to the top floor of the house. And then when we sold them, I had to bring them all back down again. And that whole action, I don't miss that. I don't miss thinking about, like, if we moved house, how would I move them? Storing them and looking after them and being worried about, oh, the heating's on. Is that going to melt a record that's sitting nearby? Like, I don't miss any of that side of it. So, you know, the thought of like selling the records is like, you know, kind of missing the music, but the music still exists, right? That's what I was reminded of when I was sitting on the train listening to Mogwai. And so all I was really selling was just the evidence of all of this. So, and then there was the like getting away from the record collection. A year ago, that goes, guy comes and picks them up in a van, takes it away, and it was gone. And I don't think Yvonne probably really kind of registered that that had happened for quite some time. I don't think friends that kind of knew me expected that it would actually happen because it had been such a kind of defining part of a bit of me, right? And it's just stuff. It's not me. It's just stuff, but you get associated with it. But then comes all the ordinary stuff that we had to sell as well, right? And that took months. Documented it on YouTube videos, selling on Vinted and eBay and Facebook Marketplace and all that other kind of stuff, right? So after the records, you kind of, you know, you start to think about clothes and furniture and kitchenware and the garage items, having people come to your house, right? And then there's the big things like cars. You know, we handed cars back, company cars and leased cars and all that kind of stuff. And the random boxes. I can remember making videos sitting in my kitchen, going through stuff, finding like old cameras and memory sticks and CDs, DVDs of like things that we had done together. Now, you know, that doesn't go anywhere, like that gets kept. But when you're working your way through it, suddenly you're re-triggering kind of all of the memories. There's a lot of the kind of emotion that gets attached to all of that, right? It's not easy to just part with stuff that you've kind of built up. Even the things that you forget about start triggering memories of where you got it, why you got it. Some of it's annoying, right? Some of it you're trying to get rid of, and it's like it's just a pain in the neck. I can remember like trying to sell like furniture and arranging for people to get it, and people wanting you to deliver it, and you're like trying to sell it on Facebook Marketplace, and people not showing up, or people trying to negotiate with you, right? And reflecting back on all of that. Some things you were just like, good riddance. I'm glad that's gone. I mean, for me, the joke of all of that would be Yvonne's exercise equipment. The stepper machine that she had, which when she bought it during the lockdown period, because we couldn't go to the gym, that was in the kitchen. And then she asked me to take it to the top floor, and I couldn't carry it myself. I had to get a mate to come round and help me. And we had to take it apart to get it upstairs. And then we built it up. And then she never used it when it was upstairs. And then it had to get brought downstairs to go into the garage. And then once it was in the garage to try and sell it. And I remember the woman that came to get it, and we thought it wouldn't go in her car. I remember all of that. The whole thing was just a nightmare. It had bits coming off of it left, right, and centre, plastic plates and screws and bolts and everything. And that was a joke for me with Yvonne then saying, you know, that bloody cross trainer machine that we laughed at. And then there's like the admin of all of that, right? Everybody's got boxes of paperwork in your house, and you're like, what do you do with it all? I'd gone through all my dad's bills and car insurance and council tax and British gas bills and Scottish power bills and all that other stuff that still lingers with me now. You go through all of that stuff, right? And then you're like, do you keep it? Do you throw it away? How do you throw it away? Do you go to the skip? Do you burn it? Do you rip it up? Do you shred it? Yvonne wanted to hire an industrial shredder at one point to try and get rid of paperwork. And then also comes the question, right, of like, will I regret it? I can remember at one point I sold a pair of trainers, right, on Vinted, and somebody left me a comment saying, "Who the hell would buy a second-hand pair of trainers?" And I'm like, "I guess you've never seen Vinted, because that's pretty much what it's made up of, people's second-hand clothes." It's amazing what we sold, shoes of Yvonne's, and you look at things, right, and you're like, "Am I even that person anymore?" Things that you would have worn that you're like, I look at some clothes when I was going through all of that, and I'm like, I'm 47 years old and I'm trying to dress like a 15-year-old skateboarder sent to Blink 182. When do you mentally click out of that? When do you start shopping in Marks and Spencers in the adult section for the grey clothes? But all of that, right? It's a lot of decisions to be made, and it is exhausting. You cannot underestimate how exhausting it is. And almost simultaneously, we were doing that twice. My dad's house and our own house. So, what stayed? This is the other side of it, right? You don't get rid of everything. Some things matter more than others. And we have a storage unit in Glasgow now. It's about the size of a walk-in cupboard. It's still full. And in August, I'll get presented with the first bill for it, the first annual bill for it. I think it's something like £700 or something for a year. I'm sure it'll have gone up. I'm sure there'll be an increase. But what's in it? Well, things that we didn't sell. I had a t-shirt collection. I couldn't really get through it all, so it stayed. It was fairly compacted down into boxes. Our own paperwork, right? Things that you just you realize you need. Birth certificates and documentation and just things that you're like, I need to keep a hold of that. I kept a hold of some of my dad's stuff. Sentimental items, small things. Still kept some music stuff. I kept some of my own record collection of all of the records that went, anything that had my own name on it. I kept my own releases, my own back catalogue. They stayed. Things that we just couldn't make decisions on. Yvonne's important stuff as well. So that storage unit is filled. You just can't get rid of it all. But it's not a massive storage unit with like a bed, a TV, like things that the way I looked at it was like, what's the point in keeping a bed in a storage unit for like 5 years, 10 years? If we come back, if we don't come back, you'll pay more in storage than you will to just replace that thing. Like a TV, why would you put a TV in a storage unit, right? In 5 years' time, 10 years' time, it'll be out of date, right? We'll be unfolding TVs and sticking them on the wall probably in that time. Now, I know what will also happen here. Somebody will listen to this and say, "So you are planning on coming back?" Right? That's always the comment that I get. "So you are planning on coming back? You've kept a storage unit." Like I say, you can't get rid of everything. You can't make plans to just completely eliminate all things in your life. There will be some important items that you'll want to keep. That's why we have that storage unit. Part of going through the tax assessment and the situational residence test is also confirming that we haven't left a household full of items behind. And the storage unit that we've got is basically just the bare essentials. Do you know, if like, we didn't want to burden a family member by saying, like Yvonne's mum and dad, can we put this in a spare bedroom or something? And it's just all sitting there gathering dust. That's why it's in a storage unit. It made sense. And the bill felt relatively manageable out of all of that. So we didn't get rid of everything. We kept the things that really mattered. So it's not really about owning nothing. It's just really knowing why you still own this one thing in particular. That was really what that came down to. So then what comes at the other side of all of that, right, is a strange kind of freedom. It's like there's a bit of relief in all of that. it's kind of hard to describe, but it's like, see, when you no longer have to make decisions about the clothes you've got, like when you wake up in the morning, you're thinking, I'm off to the office today. I need a suit, a tie, a shirt, a pair of shoes. Then you get home and you're in your joggies or your comfies, and then you've got your bedwear. None of that exists anymore. We've got a few days worth of clothes, and that kind of carries us. So there's no house to worry about. There's no car to insure anymore. There's no road tax to consider. There's no furniture. There's no future projects in the garage. There's no loft stuff that you're thinking, oh God, a new thing comes in, put that box up the loft. There's no boxes of accumulating paperwork building up and building up and building up. And there's no drawer in the kitchen filled with cables and kitchen utensils. That doesn't exist anymore. So there's kind of like a space in your brain that just lets all of that go. There's like a bit of grief in that. It's kind of like a separation thing, but there's also a lot of relief in kind of, just no longer having to think about those things anymore. Like, the way that I would describe this, right, is like every possession that you have kind of becomes like a hook into your attention. So, I would have a guitar, I had music equipment, I had my record collection. So every hook is a bit of your attention. And you don't really think about each hook individually. But one day you just realize you've been walking around absolutely covered in them. That was what I felt like when we got back from Lanzarote in April of last year, when I looked around the house and I saw everything with these fresh eyes of a month out of the country with just the bare bones essentials and looking round this house. And it made me, I burst into tears. I just found the weight of it all so overbearing. And I think back to that time now, owning nothing, and it feels very, very different. It's like a whole mental space of your brain is just gone, clear to think about other things. And for me, that's kind of been like the creativity side of things, not having to think about stuff. So I'll say this much, right? One suitcase, that's what we have now. We left with two, we have one. Threw one away. And it isn't always romantic. Like, living with less also has its challenges at times. Like, it's not always like freedom. I don't want to give that impression that get rid of all your things and you'll live free. It's not. There is also another side to all of this. Sometimes it can be annoying. Sometimes you think about things that you need. Yvonne talked about it in her Substack tonight. She thinks about little things that she might need, or she walks into a kitchen like the one behind me and has a look for utensils and how we're going to cook things and they're missing. And that's those moments that you start to think about it, right? And you think about, there's no denying this. I think about my old bed, think about our old kitchen. I think about little things that you would have had, like your favorite mug, cooking utensils, things that you would have prepared food with, familiar clothes, things like those comfies that you would get into in an evening and be able to just relax in. When you have less choice, you just have to kind of manage that. I miss like a comfortable living room, big TV that we would watch. You miss those little things. So it's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect. And living from just one suitcase, it also can just really highlight how small a life that you can have before it becomes cluttered with like all of those possessions. So, there's always still the question about like buying things. Like, what do you buy? And when I think about that, I have to think about, can it go in the suitcase? How are we going to carry this? Now, we do still buy things, right? We still go through that process. So buying things feels very different now. It feels more focused. We go into shops. We were in a shopping mall at the weekend. I bought myself a new little sports camera. I had my eye on, and Yvonne needed some new underwear. We bought a couple of other little things. We needed a new umbrella. But you go into places and you start asking yourself, do I need this? How much room is it going to take up? Do I want to spend this money? Suddenly it becomes a much more disciplined shop. Before I would just have ordered things, we would both have been guilty of just log on to Amazon, order it, it gets delivered the next day. Sometimes I would order things and they would come weeks later and I would forget about it. So I would get the dopamine hit of ordering it. And then it would come and I'd completely forgotten I'd ordered it and I'll get the dopamine hit again. But I was never really asking myself, like, if I've forgotten that I've ordered this, did I ever really need it in the first place? Like that consumerism. And now I find myself standing in a shop like, I need a couple of pairs of boxer shorts. How many do I need? How many do I really need? 2, 3? I've got a week's worth. How many? How often are we washing? Like these little things. Will I use it? Do I really need it? And then there's a kind of delay part that goes into all of that where we think, right, if I wait, I'll test myself as to whether I'll actually really need it or not. That's another whole kind of new position for us. Weight comes into a lot of things. How much weight is this adding to how much we're going to be carrying around different countries? And then you're also just thinking about little things like the heat and the humidity, right? I wear a lot of band t-shirts. These are not ideal for out here. Black t-shirt in the blazing sunshine. So there's things that we want to get rid of now. And then there's also things like we go to the gym, so you need a bit of sportswear, a pair of trainers. Do you have walking shoes, trainers, flip-flops? That's 3 pairs of shoes. So, you have to try and make decisions. And then you're thinking about going on flights and on trains. The train at the weekend was freezing. We had hoodies and trousers on for the first time I can even remember, for the first time since probably we've left maybe on a flight. That's been about it. So you have to kind of have that in your mindset, but it makes you ask questions about stuff. So when you live out of a suitcase, right, every purchase has to justify its weight. Now, let me just give a little bit of a joke in all of this, right? A little bit of kind of sarcasm, but a little bit politically minded, right? Of course, there are organizations who would like you to own nothing and be happy. The WEF, the World Economic Federation or Foundation or whatever they're called, Klaus Schwab. They famously have the motto that was part of one of their white papers: you will own nothing and you will be happy. So I just want to say, like, I'm very much living in that world, but this was done through choice. This was done through a trigger in a real life situation that took me down a path of thinking about possessions and the idea that at some stage somebody would have to make a choice on those decisions. So this isn't a this isn't a preparing for the new world order. This is just something that applied to my life in that particular moment and also for Yvonne. And sometimes owning less can just feel freer when it's chosen. That was my situation. We wanted to feel freer, and that's what it gave us. Owning less felt more freeing. So the big question in all of this, right? Do I regret it? This is the part, definitely got to be honest in all of this. Yvonne and I have spoken about these moments, these topics, the record collection, the stuff that we'd acquired over all those years, the selling of things, TVs, Sonos, DJ equipment, identity parts of your life. Do I regret all of that? I've got to say at this point, and again, I always try and present this, asterisks, accepting that it's a year later that you don't know what you're going to feel like in 2 years and 5 years. I'll revisit these topics down the line. I can only give you the here and now. I can only give you my real answer for right now. And that's that I don't miss that stuff. When I was listening to Mogwai on the train, it didn't make me miss that I had that record in a brand new wrapper somewhere on a shelf. It didn't happen. And I don't miss the stuff. Because the time that all of that's given Yvonne and I to just live life, relax, enjoy the sunshine, the weather, get fit and healthy, all of that has been a better trade-off at this point. Again, I completely recognise I can only give you the experience of 1 year out. I can only tell you here and now. But that's how I feel about it. I'm not missing it. I don't miss that stuff. I don't miss the house. I don't miss the car. I don't miss driving. So that's kind of where it's at. So here's what I'll say to all of that, right? What has the last 12 months taught me out of all of this? That would be that you can live with less than you think. Some possessions are useful, some are precious to you, some are identity props, and some possessions are just delayed decisions. Clearing out a parent's house of all of their own possessions made me really think about my own belongings, my own things. And that selling things wasn't just like a financial decision. It carried a huge amount of emotional weight that was attached to it. Freedom is not just having money in all of this. Freedom is about reducing the amount of things that will quietly own your attention. And like having stuff isn't bad. I'm not here to like sell you on the get rid of your possessions, get rid of your stuff. But unconscious accumulation has a cost attached to all of it. So it isn't this, I'm not here to say to you, how little can you own? It's not really the question that I wanted to set out to ask in all of this. It's more just like when you look at your things, are they still worth carrying? So comes back to that train station last week, right? 1 suitcase, 2 bags, a lifetime of stuff, a full house, 3-story, 2-story, whatever you want to call it, townhouse, condensed down into 1 bag, 1 trolley bag, and 2 rucksacks on our bag. And Yvonne saying to me, it needs to be less. And honestly, she's probably right. The next day, we went out to the shopping mall and we bought Yvonne a new rucksack that will allow her to condense down a few more things out of the suitcase. And the goal, the ultimate goal would be not to have the suitcase. But for now, it's just shrinking down a little bit more. So it's not really because like owning things is wrong. It's not because possessions don't matter. It's just really like some of those things belong in your old life. Some things were just there to prove who you used to be. That's what I kind of equate the record collection a little bit to be. The records are gone, but the music still exists. It's in my phone. Still listening to it the exact same way as I used to. All of the stuff from the house, that's all gone. But Yvonne and I are still here, still traveling around, still doing exactly what we set out to do, which is just relax, enjoy your days, live a little bit lighter, a little bit more stress-free. So maybe the question isn't how much can I get rid of from my life? Maybe the question in all of that is really just how much of it is still worth carrying. Right, that is episode 17. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening to all of that. I hope that's maybe given you a little bit of insight into 12 months worth of decisions. Give you something to think about. Next Wednesday, a new topic, present it live. And from tomorrow, this will be available on Spotify. If you want to follow me over there, Second Wind is the podcast. I'd love a follow, a little like on it, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great evening.